for everyone for coming and good evening or good afternoon, wherever you are. And we have Fabrizio and Hara today, and their talk is titled Affective Effects as Key Theoretical Tools for Prosodic Pragmatic Analysis. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Ryoko and Kate, for having us. Feel very excited for talking to you about our and to everyone about our project. Um, so just to have an outline of what our presentation will include, we will start with some literature on emotions in simultaneous interpreting and definition of simultaneous interpreting in relevance theory, and then we will move on to how relevance treats emotions. We'll talk about our corpus and methodology, and we'll have cherry-picked some extracts to do some analysis and showcase our results. And then hopefully we'll reach to our conclusion on time. So we will start with this quote from Mercier and Sperber, who they argue that we are not just rational beings. We have, the human ability to recognize emotions because we have this well-developed expertise to use facial expressions, tone of voice, and bodily movements, and so on as evidence of mood that allows us to read the mood of others. So this quote captures something we all do effortlessly in everyday interactions, this ability to read others. We don't just process utterances, but we constantly interpret tone of voice, facial expression, and bodily cues to understand and interpret what others really mean and how they feel. So, in other words, communication is deeply emotional and multimodal. So that's what we want to express, to explore today. So I'm giving the floor to Fabrizio.
Yes, so hello. Just a brief overview of what simultaneous interpreting is all about. It is a very taxing cognitive task. Interpreters are called upon to render the speech as being delivered by a speaker into another language with a minimal time lag. This is very important. So, obviously, there's been challenges from the AI world. Today, we talk about speech-to-speech interpreting more and more often. And there's a huge debate in my field in interpreting studies whether AI systems will be able to be well positioned to please their users, and or if degradation and omission of certain features, in particular non-verbal features, are a problem. They are at the moment. We don't know in the future, at least so far. Okay, let's go to the next
Mhm.
slide. So again, just a brief overview of what simultaneous interpreting is all about. You have a source text speaker, ST speaker, who's autonomous, and they use all sorts of channels of communication, as you can imagine. And you have a target text speaker, in this case, the simultaneous interpreter, who depends fully on the source text speaker's message, and their non-verbal communication is limited to voice, to prosodic and suprasegmental elements. This is really important to acknowledge at this stage. So when we, however, evaluate simultaneous interpreting, obviously we evaluate their quality based also on these features, non-verbal features, so voice and delivery, hugely important part. So in simultaneous interpreting studies, fluency is defined as the degree to which speech is articulated smoothly and continuously without any unnatural breakdown in flow. It has to be a normal way of speaking, if you want. Obviously, this emerges from the integration of prosodic elements, including speech rate, pauses, vowel and consonant lengthening, and so forth. And when it comes to effect, we have had some studies on it. we see that interpreters operate under huge time pressure, high cognitive load, and often emotionally charged content, because mostly it is political speech, and so it's highly emotional and persuasive in function. So we need to understand the role of effect in simultaneous interpreting. So as I said, we have had some studies done over the past 20 years, and we have moved from a cognitivist model to an effect integrated model. Emotion is no longer seen as a disturbance, but a huge factor. And in particular, Rojo Lopez and other colleagues have explicitly situated this within broader cognitive science, where emotion and cognition are deeply intertwined. Just again, a brief overview of what simultaneous interpreting studies have said so far. We have identified 6 kind of functions of effect in simultaneous interpreting. And so, again, I repeat, we've moved from a modular view of cognition to an integrated model. So taken together, these 6 dimensions support a view of effect in SI as a multifunctional, dynamic, and bidirectional construct. So effect can modulate cognitive load, it can regulate attention, it can interact with working memory of the interpreter, it can shape performance outcomes, and it can drive prosodic expression. So just again, briefly, I'm going to explain all 6 of these functions, starting from the cognitive load modulator. So effect impacts cognitive load of the interpreter, both negatively and positively. Positive effect can improve cognitive flexibility and efficiency on the part of the interpreter. So emotion dynamically modulates how cognitive resources are allocated. Then attention and working memory. So they're both affected. Attention, in particular, emotional stimuli attract attention, and this can be both disruptive but also adaptive as it highlights relevant information. And secondly, working memory. We've seen how emotional content can consume resources on the part of the interpreter. We call it intrusive emotional load, but also enhance encoding and recall emotionally salient items. Therefore, emotion both constrains and supports interpreter processing. As a performance modulation, effect has clear consequences. It influences the interpreter's accuracy, fluency, speed, error patterns, but also emotional engagement can enhance delivery and it can improve communicative effectiveness. Then prosody. We said it's got a huge role to play because we use our voice for our work. So emotion is expressed through prosody, obviously. Interpreters must convey the speaker's emotional tone while managing their own affective state. So we're working with intonation, rhythm, voice quality, and effect is central to the expressive dimension of interpreting. So interpreters have to reproduce the speaker's emotional tone and they have to regulate their own emotional expression. So it's a bidirectional thing. In particular, with a focus on prominence, there has been limited work on prominence in SI. There's some evidence that suggests that these features play a vital role in preserving pragmatic fidelity. If you use it inadequately, it may obscure information structure, but if you use it skillfully, it can enhance the target text comprehensibility and the listener engagement. Just one thing I need to make clear, we are working cross-linguistically, and this complicates things further because obviously the interpreters must not only identify the function of prominence and the relevance of prominence, but also they need to transpose it into a completely different culture and language system, which in a natural and effective way. So if failure to do so risks neutralizing pragmatic force or diminish rhetorical impact, which is really important in terms of persuasion. And lastly, professional competence. Interpreters have to develop their own emotional regulation. So this is on them. They need to manage stress, they need to control empathy. And this transforms emotion from a risk into a professional resource. So just to conclude this first introductory bit, effect in SI is not peripheral, it is not disruptive, but it's integrated, fully integrated into cognition, it's functionally relevant, and it's professionally managed or manageable. So this marks a major shift within SI studies toward a more holistic model of human cognition. And again, very briefly, I'm sure most of you are aware of Gut's work on TNI, translation interpreting. Translation interpreting within relevance theory are seen as interlingual interpretive use. So the translation interpreting are not a direct transfer of material, but rather a meta representation. So the target text is an interpretation of the source text communicator's intended meaning, which itself is already an interpretation of a prior thought. So our task here is to produce an ostensive stimulus that achieves optimal relevance for the target audience, balancing cognitive effects with processing effort. Cognitive and also obviously now affective effects. And a focus on simultaneous interpreting has been done by Seton, 1999 in particular, whereby he defined interpreting conference as modular mental faculty that integrates linguistic decoding with pragmatic inference. So interpreters must exploit the contextual clues to update a mental model of the source target communicator's intentions against which they formulate the message in the target language. So quality is defined as fidelity plus relevance, and faithfulness after Gut is defined in terms of interpretive resemblance, so in terms of shared explictures and implictures. And lastly, a focus on prosody by Seton. Again, it's got a pivotal role to play within interpreting because it directs listeners to the intended conceptual assumptions, and features of prosodic coloring, etc., enable interpreters to restore perspective, to emphasize focal elements, and to manage listener comprehension, even when syntactic fidelity is compromised. Okay, so floor is now to you, Hara.
Great, thank you, Fabrizio. So, as you know, in relevance theory, effective communication is understood in terms of effects and effort, and the least amount of processing efforts will yield at least a good amount of effects. So, traditionally in relevance theory, we have cognitive effects, and Sperber and Wilson in the relevance theorists' Bible have identified three types of cognitive effects. So the first involves contextual implications, which cannot be derived from the propositional content of a single utterance. So it's a combination of two or more that results in cognitive effects. The second type involves strengthening old assumptions, and the final subtype includes cognitive effects that result in contradicting old assumptions, either by abandoning them or revising them. And in relevance communication and cognition, Sperber and Wilson also referred to affective effects as a wide array of minute cognitive effects. And later on, Wharton and Stray discuss affective effects, although at that time they use the term positive emotional effects as the bridges between, on the one hand, feelings and sensations, and on the other, cognition as traditionally construed. And what what these positive emotional effects do is that they persist, working in tandem with the course of reasoning. They have motivated and continuing to influence the hearer in the search of relevance. So what they suggest is that the course of reasoning may be affected by one's emotional state, and discuss this type of effect. Now, before I dive into affective effects, I want to highlight this quote that I go back to one of my favorite papers from Tim, where he discusses emotion within relevance theory, and Fabrizio and I believe that it fits in this project as well. So communication isn't solely about the propositional content; it's about something else. And when you communicate with others, you communicate much more than proposition. So this something else, according to Wharton, here is emotion. Pardon me. So building on this previous work that I mentioned by Wharton and Stray, Wharton and Dessaucier discuss more extensively the notion of affective effects, and they divide them into two categories. So the first one is primary affective effects, and these do not involve a search of relevance. They are precursors to inference and as a consequence to cognitive effects. They are further divided into two categories. So you have anticipatory and transfer effects. Anticipatory effects are the ones who will be input to cognitive processes and will motivate, anticipate a course of action. Transfer effects occur when we communicate information about our emotional states to others, and constrain the construction of context by passing any propositional inferential processes. So they result in reduced effort, and with that they maximize relevance. The idea behind transfer effects is also in line with the notion of emotional contagion, according to which emotional communication is not only communicates purely conceptual information about emotional states, but communicates something of the emotional state itself. And the second category is secondary affective effects. So these capture the relation between thought and affective states because they are prompted by proposition. So they are an extra product of communication as a result of interpretation. And therefore, they will emerge only after interpreting utterances. They often arise on the basis of pre-existing psychological material. This could be memories of similar or relevant affective experiences, and that taps in on the ability we have as humans to simulate other perspectives and make certain scenes relevant. And secondary affective effects could be triggered by descriptions of situations and sequences of events and psychological states of individuals. They are also processed with regard to the reader's cognitive environment, or the hearer's cognitive environment and their psychological environment, and they evoke a particular emotional context in the audience's mind. And often, if we're talking about reading something and trying to imagine it, their imaginative abilities. So the relationship between effort and effect is key in effective communication, and often we've seen affective effects and cognitive effects interacting. And this interaction becomes even more prominent in cases where the relationship might either be imbalanced or we want to ensure that this balance is kept. So the primary affective effects, either depending if they would be anticipatory or transfer, they will trigger cognitive effects. The cognitive effects will trigger secondary affective effects. So we have a constant feedback loop and a cognitive affective loop. Pardon me. So one area that emotions come into play is rhetoric, argumentation, and persuasion, as Fabrizio mentioned earlier. The way we choose words is more often than not a deliberate, conscious act, especially when we aim to influence others' way of thinking and acting. We will aim to appeal to their reasoning or by appealing to their emotions, and sometimes doing both at the same time. Manipulative strategies are very often in times of crisis or when crises are attempted to be managed or resolved, such as during the pandemic or in political discourse, as we'll talk about political debate today. And from an evolutionary perspective, emotions guide what we say and how we say it. They act as built-in rules that guide communication, guide relevance, and think, for example, how you communicate when you are angry or embarrassed, for example. So Oswald and I don't remember how to pronounce Titia's last name, so excuse me for that. So they have both worked extensively on persuasion and argumentation, and Oswald in particular has effectively used relevance theory in his work on persuasion and argues in favor of relevance theory as it accounts for how we interpret utterances and how we evaluate what matters and how we respond. So the audience will select the possible interpretation that is the easiest to process and those that fit the expectations of relevance. And these pragmatic constraints are, in effect, in argument, understanding, and interpretation. And manipulation is another form of communication, one that, to quote Didier and Oswald, that puts the addressee in a situation where she or he will be led to shallow process contextual assumptions. So manipulation constitutes a form of cognitive constraint on the election of contextual assumptions. Now, to borrow a quote that I haven't added here on the slide, but it's from Wharton's monograph on nonverbal communication. Communication does not occur in a vacuum, and in pragmatics, context is undoubtedly important. So context acts as a constraint of interpretation. So sorry, I think I missed the, yeah, sorry, I missed the slide. So contexts are undoubtedly really, really important and constrain interpretation. So certain contexts, those that might be overwhelming, for example, and tap on our emotions, will have an effect on the audience's cognitive environment and will impact the salience of contextual assumptions by directing it. As a result, they have the ability, the power, if you like, to constrain the outcome of interpretation by directing it. So on top of that, manipulation also minimizes the cognitive effort because it constrains the context further, so the audience will follow the path of the least effort. And affective effects have their special spot here as well. In arguments, for example, as Wharton and Dessaucier argue in one of their papers, affective effects might become dominant. And remember the cognitive affective loop in the earlier slide. So we go from secondary to primary. So I believe this is what Wharton and Dessaucier were talking about in this paper that was earlier from the Pragmatics and Emotions book. And going back to the book, that it's our main theoretical tool, affective effects have a key role in human interaction. They orient us towards attitudes of trust in relation with their contribution to relevance, and can be set into motion in persuasive discourse, acting as a constraint of relevance. Primary affective effects have an impact on how we process and attract attention to the most relevant element in the environment. And secondary affective effects, on the other hand, will activate at a lesser cost an array of surplus inputs which complement the propositional meaning that has already been delivered by the speaker. So since our topic and real life data is from an EU debate, which makes me think I should have mentioned that initially. So that's on me. This quote from Wharton and de Saussure, we believe fits like a glove. So they argue that the true function of influence is borne by the affective effects elicited by the non-linguistic means, tone of voice and attitude. So in terms of affect and prosody, pragmatic inference and relevance play a central role in how we interpret prosody, as argued by Wilson and Wharton. And prosody is not just an added layer to speech, it's an integral part of how we construct meaning within relevance theory. Listeners aim to derive the most relevant interpretation with the least cognitive effort, so prosodic cues help that and act as a constraint, as a procedural constraint. So in this sense, understanding tone of voice involves pragmatic inference, and listeners will use contextual and vocal information together to infer what the speaker intends to convey. Wharton also emphasizes that nonverbal behaviors convey meaning beyond traditional linguistic communication. So they will enrich and reinforce, sometimes override verbal content, and they play, again, a crucial role in how meaning is understood and interpreted. About the function of affective tone of voice, again, Wharton in his earlier work argues that emotional tone can facilitate the retrieval of propositional content, and he uses interjections as examples. So what's important is that this process operates through procedural encoding, and it guides the listener inferential processes by shaping how the propositional content should be processed rather than simply adding to. And finally, prosody can be seen as guiding the listener through the entire interpretive process. So it helps the listeners access the appropriate cognitive context, evaluate the speaker's contribution, and construct the interaction itself, so communication takes place. So together, all these kind of use on prosody, nonverbal cues are fundamental to realize how relevance is achieved in communication, and it shapes, how it shapes interpretation, and interaction. And Madej and Wharton in their account of multimodal communication, they argue that prosody can be understood as a form of gesture. So in this sense, prosody becomes a part of a broader multimodal system in which meaning is conveyed through multiple coordinated channels. So a key example is contrastive stress, or also known as vocal pointing. So just as a speaker might use a hand gesture to direct attention to something in particular, prosody will emphasize and direct the listener's attention to a specific part of the utterance. So we interpret this kind of stress in much the same way as we would interpret a pointing gesture. So with this framework, attention to prosody is crucial because you can bridge the gap between propositional content and the speaker's attitude. Contrastive stress can also be understood as acute ostension, as discussed by Scott, because it introduces elements of unexpectedness or extra processing effort, and in a way it signals to the listener that additional cognitive effects are available, so it's worth pursuing. So that encourages a deeper search for meaning, guiding the hearer towards certain interpretations. So the floor is yours, Fabrizio.
Thank you, Hera. So just a brief overview of our spoken corpus. and methodology. Well, first of all, obviously, we need to find a correlation between the original speakers and the English booth interpreters' affect-related patterns and their dynamic evolution over time. So that's why we've chosen a spoken corpus of real-life speeches from the EU Parliament. It's a debate on foreign and defence affairs from 2025. We've chosen 15 speeches delivered in 5 different languages: German, Greek, Italian, Portuguese, and Spanish. You'll see that so we've chosen English as a target text language, and mostly non-Germanic languages as a source text language, because we wanted to research that, select them for representativity. And obviously typological differences, contrasting source and target languages were chosen for this reason. It's important to say that both the MEPs and the source text and the target text speakers, so the interpreters, can see the MEPs speaking, and all the other MEPs in the parliament. So they see the non-verbal elements. Okay, let's move on to so this is the table for a corpus, 15 speeches, as I said, split up into 5 different languages. Overall, they're about 20 minutes as total duration. They come from different parts of the debate. The transcription was a bit long because obviously we need it to be extra exhaustive. We've used transcription conventions that are very common in interpreting studies, and we've also used some softwares, Elan and Pratt in particular, which again are very common in cognitive translation interpreting studies. Methodologically, we start from this point of departure. Persuasion is very much used in these kinds of debates. It's a highly effect-driven type of debate under time pressure, and in this kind of interpreting mediated debate, persuasion therefore depends on the interpreter's ability to preserve effective effects. So persuasion depends on how the interpreter preserves a perceived relevance and effects. Effective framework proposed by Wharton and de Saussure, as Jara said, is our effective machinery, if you want. You've talked about it, so we can now move on to the next slide. We have 3 major research questions. First of all, do interpreters replicate and or pragmatically compensate for effect, or do they downplay it? Do they neutralize it under conditions of cognitive load? Secondly, do interpreters introduce new affect patterns absent from the source text in order to support cohesion or perhaps convey intensity, surprise, etc.? And thirdly, based on the first 2 research questions, a broader question, if you want, ensues. So if the primary objective of interpreting, we said, is to deliver a quality service, should a purely utilitarian definition of fitness for purpose, so it's the one for machine interpreting systems, be considered sufficient, even at the expense of pragmatic fidelity? So our analysis found that the interpreting practice is very variable with respect to the rendition of effect. And we found there's 3 major categories. So you have operational renditions of effect cues, you have the total emissions of them, or you have additions, both non-speaker and speaker-oriented additions. Okay. In particular, speaker-oriented additions are very interesting. They are not present in the source text, but nonetheless, they are attributed by the listeners to the original speaker. And, at first glance, you might think that the addition of these cues appear to contravene the principle of fidelity. However, by enhancing the sense of reciprocity and shared orientation, these cues facilitate a rendition that is perceived as more natural, more effective. So paradoxically, that although the interpreter interferes, but this contributes to the very invisibility required by the institutional norms. So, first extract is from a MEP called Demirel in German. We are going straight to the video, I think. There's a transcription underneath anyway, you can see it. So we're going to listen to, first of all, the original speech by the MEP, and then to the English booth interpretation, okay? She talks about, she's a left-wing politician and talks about, the fact that the EU is no longer very democratic because they all think about militarization all the time.
Demokratie müsse man aufrüsten. Doch im Zuge der weltweiten Aufrüstung geraten liberale Freiheiten immer weiter unter Druck. Autokraten bleiben ihre Premiumpartner, solange sie ihren geopolitischen Interessen entsprechen, ihnen ihre Märkte öffnen und Ressourcen zugänglich machen. Diese Doppelmoral schadet. So verlieren sie nicht nur Glaubwürdigkeit im Ausland, sondern auch hier. Einhergehend mit dem Militarismus stärkt auch der Rechtspopulismus.
You've seen how she's using her hands, gestures to point at the audience. She's looking at them directly. She's, standing at the podium, but she's, using her eye gaze to engage. She's using her hands to point, to mark specific words. Okay, let's listen to the interpretation first, and then we move on to the slide with the translation as well.
It is. Yes, it's necessary to rearm, but one has to understand that liberal principles are under ever greater pressure doing that. It is vital that we realize what our real geopolitical principles ought to be, and we should get away from the double standards that we are all too often resorting to, because we simply lose credibility.
Okay, so let's look at the previous slide because it has the back translation in it. So what happens here is that persuasion in the source text, you can see, is driven by emphatic prosodic accusation, especially with the use of this repeated "you're here," reinforced by the gestures that you've all seen. So in relevance theoretic terms, these are procedural cues generating strong primary affective effects. Indignation and confrontation are triggered before full proposition reasoning. In the English interpretation, the content about these double standards, loss of credibility from the EU is preserved, but the accusatory "you" is softened into a more inclusive framing. So as a result, primary effect is reduced while secondary affective effects remain. So the audience still infers hypocrisy, but through reflection rather than direct emotional impact. Okay, let's move on to, I would say, di Meo. So from Italian into English. Skip the second one and go straight to the Italian.
That's the Italian. Do you have to that one?
Yeah, that one.
Mm-hmm.
So again, look at his bodily gestures, his gaze, etc.
L'Europa ha bisogno di una capacità di deterrenza credibile che mostri al mondo un'unione forte, coesa e capace di proteggere i propri cittadini, i propri interessi e i propri valori. Per questo dobbiamo rafforzare il pilastro europeo all'interno della NATO, con cui dobbiamo essere in sinergia, non in competizione, assumendoci la nostra parte di responsabilità e rendendo l'Alleanza Atlantica e l'Occidente tutto ancora più forte. Ma è fondamentale anche un cambio di percezione culturale, perché quando parliamo di difesa i cittadini non vanno spaventati, né possiamo pensare solo alla dimensione militare. Oggi difesa significa anche cybersicurezza, tutele delle infrastrutture critiche e delle rotte commerciali, dell'approvvigionamento energetico, significa controllo dell'immigrazione irregolare e supporto nelle attività di protezione civile. La sicurezza non è un costo. Investire nella difesa non significa fare la guerra, ma è il presupposto della nostra stabilità sociale ed economica, della nostra libertà, della nostra credibilità internazionale. O diventiamo attori globali o continueremo.
Okay, let's listen to a bit from the English booth.
Okay, so
Necessity. We need to have credible deterrent capacity, showing that we are strong and united and able to protect our citizens, our interests, and our values. Therefore, we need to strengthen the European pillar within NATO, and we need to work in synergy with NATO. We need to be responsible, and we need to ensure that the Atlantic Alliance and European alliances are ever stronger. This is a moment of great importance. People can be afraid of the military aspect of defense, but defense now, we need to explain to them, means protection. It means energy security, control of immigration, protection of your borders, and civil protection. Of course, it has a cost. In defense, it's not equivalent to.
Let's have a look at the transcript, the slide prior to this one, so that you've got the back translation as well. And so this case is very different from the one before. Di Maio's speech relies on low arousal effect, highly structural coherence, and there's loads of triads: citizens, interests, values. This triad in particular functions procedurally, reducing processing effort, producing primary effective effects of stability and trust rather than emotion. So a key move is the explicit reassurance that citizens should not be frightened. Now, the English interpreter preserves this triadic structure, adapts it to English prosodic norms, which is really interesting, with a final climax. So in triadic structures in English have a final climax instead of the one that we have at the beginning. And thus enhancing clarity, enhancing confidence. So relevance is optimized through the organization rather than emotional intensity. Okay, let's move on to my last speech. Let's Olivera number 2.
okay.
Now, this one is again left-wing and is very critical of the EU's role regarding a particular Gaza in the international law.
Confrontação. E são também um exercício despoderado de hipocrisia e desprezo pelos princípios de direito internacional, por uma União Europeia que recusa condenar Israel e o seu genocídio contra o povo palestiniano, sendo cúmplice dessa política de genocídio. Uma União Europeia que foi cúmplice de guerras de agressão na Síria, na Líbia, no Iraque ou no Afeganistão. Senhora Comissária, este não é o sentido que serve os interesses.
Let's listen to the English interpretation.
Interference, confrontation, and it seems to me utterly hypocritical as an exercise. We're also basically attacking international law. And look at what's happening with the people of Palestine, the fact that we are complicit in this policy of genocide. And therefore, we know that there is guilt at issue here. Syria, Afghanistan, etc. This is not in the interest of the people. If we really wanted to defend the interest...
let's move on to the prior slide so that there's a back translation again. So again, we go back to if you want, the first speech from the German MEP. There's him stressing the most important words with his gestures, pointing, etc. So in his speech, the source text speech, he intensifies condemnation through emphatic stress, through explicit accusations of complicity. And this design produces both strong primary effective effects and powerful secondary effects via inference. In the English interpretation, a crucial move here is explicitation. So, for example, the interpreter states that guilt is at issue. This is an addition. This reduces inferential effort, but reshapes the affective experience. So emotion becomes more reflective, more forensic, if you want. So relevance is maintained, but the preservative, the persuasive trajectory shifts from immediacy to explicit moral reasoning. Okay, floor's yours, Shkara. We don't have much time left, I think, but...
Yeah, I'll do mine are quite short, so let me just see the seconds. Just probably. So for my part of the corpus, I had three Greek speakers from kind of different political parties, not extremely similar ideologies, but a lot of part of their speech involved about borders and yeah, how the EU is dealing with that, the funds that they need to be put in place. So, sorry.
Από αυτές της Ευρώπης. Οι δύο εκθέσεις του Κοινοβουλίου για την εξωτερική πολιτική, την ασφάλεια και την άμυνα τεκμηριώνουν την ανάγκη σε αυτό το νέο και ασταθές περιβάλλον η Ένωση να έχει ισχυρή παρουσία.
So that was from the Greek speaker. Now the interpreter should be there.
Future with stronger and the report on foreign policy and security and defense, I think, shows the need in this new unstable environment for the Union to have a strong presence with its.
So, as you can see, and with the back translation as well on my data, so Magnatis, what he signals initially is numeric and assailants. So it's important, that there are two reports, and that, aggravates the importance, not just one. Whereas with the interpreter focuses again on the reports. He uses lengthening, suggesting, that where to put emphasis. He pauses briefly to retain focus and heightens the rhetorical importance. We have neo, so something new, breaks from previous forms. Astathes, so there's an implication of risk-oriented evaluation. There's no implication or hesitation, no implication of questioning. His tone is authoritative. He doesn't use much gesture. He mainly reads his notes, and he's very assertive and serious, aiming at persuasive intent. So there's no overt emotional display of affect. The interpreter aims to reconstruct these affective cues and optimize relevance and make use of prominence. Have reports, defense, so on and so forth. And there are pitch movements and heightened stress, aiming to approximate the institutional authority that Magnatis is trying to establish with the source text. So the interpreter mediates the speaker's non-neutral stance and orients towards risk and communicates these expectations of shared concern. So reduces the processing effort through Prosodic. So we have heightened primary effective effects and increasing, because of the way the interpreter uses Prosodic. Shall we do another one? Fabrizio, what do you think?
I don't think we've got that time.
Okay.
Let's get to the conclusion.
Okay.
What do you think?
It's the same because I had the one who was very loud. So yeah, so just to conclude, now that we're coming towards the end of our presentation, our data effects plays a central role, is not peripheral by no means. It shapes information processing, the performance of the interpreter, and adds to their professional expertise. And our findings support the following claim that simultaneous interpreting does not remove any affect, but it redistributes it from emotional immediacy to cognitive evaluation. And SI systematically transforms affect from a procedural attention directing resource into a cognitively mediated inferential resource. So, there is some reconfiguration. Instead of, reducing the persuasive meaning, it's directing towards it. Do you want to go with that?
Yeah, so just very briefly, this model illustrates how, under cognitive constraints, interpreters systematically attenuate primary affective effects while preserving or reconstructing, we would say, secondary affective effects, so inferential, evaluative. And this redistribution is achieved through strategic operations such as omissions, additions, explicitation, resulting therefore in a shift from effect-driven relevance in the source texts to cognition-supported relevance, if you wish, in the target text, and consequently from immediate emotional persuasion to mediated discursive persuasion.
Okay. So now return to our initial 3 research questions. So the first one regarding replication versus neutralization. So SI interpreters do not systematically downplay affect. They replicate it when it's practical and partially neutralize more controversial affect by adding points of expressive prominence, and any pragmatic compensation often relies on lexical or prosodic salience when nonverbal cues are unavailable. It should be noted that target text audience could see the speaker's gestures and facial expressions, as we mentioned earlier. As for the second question, which was about the introduction of new affect patterns, so SI interpreters do make meaningful additions, like on the first extract that Fabrizio was analyzing. And these are not just artifacts of inference, they're context sensitive. So interpreters align the output with perceived constraints and any cultural norms to ensure that they fully convey the intended meaning. And finally, on our last question about fitness for purpose versus pragmatic fidelity. So in SI, fitness for purpose cannot be reduced to a purely practical notion of adequacy, because successful communication depends not only on transmitting propositional content, but on preserving pragmatic meaning, and that includes the affective aspect. So crucially, primary affective effects play a central role in maintaining pragmatic fidelity, as they preserve the speaker's emotional stance and guide the audience's inferential processes. So this emotional truth primes cognitive inferential processes, and it's crucial to persuasion. So it's not secondary, but it's foundational. When these dimensions are reduced, lost under practical constraints, the result is not just a loss of nuance, but a weakening of epistemic trust and argumentative efficacy, because audience relies on these cues to access credibility, intention, and relevance in real time. So we'll wrap up our presentation with 2 major implications. The first being the need, we want to highlight the need to move towards an expanded affect-aware pragmatics of simultaneous interpreting, where emotional and multimodal cues are treated as central to interpretation and to meaning making, rather than peripheral enhancements. And they are just indispensable in guiding relevance and interpretation. And second, we would like to draw attention to reconceptualization of interpreter as in the age of generative AI, where human interpreters are not simply transmitters of information. They're specialists in managing inference. They preserve the speaker's intention. They convey subtle, pragmatic, and effective dimensions of communication that remain beyond the reach of purely practical and utilitarian systems. So thank you. We'll make this a bit longer. I made the thank you slide, so I wanted to say a special thank you to Fabrizio's cat, which looks better than the one I found. But yeah, I don't think Bruno was very happy the timing we did our meeting. So yeah, it would be happy to answer any questions you might have, and these are our references. So yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. So, right, okay, we kind of run out of time. Very interesting, really interesting. We started 4 minutes late, so maybe we could have one question, and I hope people can stay. So, yes, maybe time for one question.
Sorry for going long.
Anyone? Daniel?
Sure. If there's only a minute or two, I feel sad at hogging the time, but I had two small comments. One is, did I understand correctly that one of my major takeaways, thanks for really interesting presentation, is that you found a general tendency for interpreters to neglect primary affective effects, or maybe you're implying that that's a necessary part of interpretation, and instead they make up for that by focusing, reinforcing secondary affective effects. Did I understand that correctly?
Shall I reply to this?
Yeah,
Yeah, I think yes. So they mainly attenuate the primary effective effects to preserve or reconstruct the secondary effective effects. I think it is strategic in simultaneous interpreting. So I'm not saying this should be the way forward, but going towards, as I said, a cognition supported relevance, it's perhaps more effective in interpreting. Remember that we just use our voice. So it's easier and under very, very strict time constraints. So it's easier if you want, rather than looking for other ways, procedural or multimodal or attention directive cues, to go straight to the secondary effective effects, so inferential evaluative effects, I would say. But I'm not saying it's the way forward. It's definitely a way, an easier way to preserve mediated discursive persuasion.
Well, I have two things maybe would be food for thought for you. One would be that in at least the EU configuration you've shown here, hearers are not completely isolated from the signals of primary affective effects from the speaker themselves, right? So they're not listening to the speaker, and they're not seeing the gestures. So clearly there must be, maybe the interpreter is assuming that they're getting some of the primary affective effects from the speaker themselves, and therefore their role is different.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Another comment is that I've seen, in my own experience, I remember having two interpreting teachers, both of whom were very different in terms of medical interpretation. For example, one of them was a great actress, really empathetic. She really put herself in the role of the patient, talking to the doctor, and was talking emotionally about the pain that the patient was experiencing. And another of my teachers was simply, he saw his role as being entirely dealing with factual and perhaps secondary affective effects, but he was not trying to model the primary affective effects. So it might be also a question of not only translator choice, but also of institutional preference. So maybe the EU interpreters are taught to ignore the primary effects and not try to model them, but to concentrate on information and eventually possibly secondary affective effects. Maybe it's not across the board interpreting. It could be an EU institutional thing that you're discovering.
Well, I agree. It's mainly to do with general conference interpreting training. So obviously they're not that aware of primary affective effects in general when we train. I've trained as well as a conference interpreter. So as you're saying, the focus is on something else in general. Yeah, so I totally agree.
Could I add something to that? I was thinking of the speaker who didn't have the Greek speaker that I didn't have the time to go through, and see someone who would speak very loud, trying to make your point come across even, I don't know, stronger. And obviously the interpreter cannot do that. But what we were discussing with Fabrizio is that the interpreter aims to compensate for this primary affective effects, is using prominence more, and there is more contrastive stress. But this in addition to any multimodal cues, because they can see her face, they can see her gestures. She uses a lot, her hands when she speaks, she would move a lot. So I think it's kind of a combination as well. Like they listen to the interpreter, yeah, they've seen, what's happening, and they kind of put two and two together, I think.
And also, sorry, it needs to be stated and remembered that when you move into English, a lot of these things are not accepted in the English speaking world. Okay, so I mentioned this at the beginning. Cross-linguistically, we need to be very aware that there are huge differences culturally between the way you use gestures in one language and culture to the other. So somebody is pointing at their finger to the audience in Portuguese, it shouldn't necessarily be the case in an English speaking world. Okay, I don't know whether. So perhaps if we look at other booths, the Italian booth, the Portuguese booth, the Greek booth, this could change. So it'd be interesting to go even more cross-linguistically. I don't know whether that makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, so Tim's got a hand up, so maybe the time we are running out of time, so Tim can. Tim will be. Can't talk. Sorry, Tim. Go ahead.
I'll interpret for you, real quick. Yeah. So, well, I don't have very much to say. I really, really enjoyed it. That's the first thing I wanted to say. Really enjoyed it because it's so nice. I mean, it's so satisfying to see kind of theoretical ideas being used in the world, as it were. So I really congratulate you for that. So there's two things I just wanted to say, and then I've actually got to go anyway. First thing is, have you got funding for this project? So
No,
so I mean,
unfortunately not. But I mean, I personally have been looking at this debate for other projects with funding, so I know this debate inside and out. And Hara has helped me out, obviously, with the Greek and the theories. But yeah,
well, I
this.
mean, I think you should really try and get funding for this because the final point you made about the necessity for simultaneous interpreters, i.e., human beings, to be involved in future developments in AI in this field, which whether we like it or not is going to happen. If it's going to happen, it may as well happen with people who know what they're doing. And I can't imagine that you wouldn't get funding for it. It's so important. Um, and if I can do anything to help with that, I will at any stage. So please. And the second thing is a really minor thing, but several people you mentioned several times, and you also mentioned in the final slide about the fact that you can, when you're in the hall listening to the simultaneous interpretation, you can see the facial expressions and the gestures of the speaker. But presumably you're listening to the interpretation into your own language. Because I noticed when I was watching the German politician speak and listening to the English that I found the gestures and the facial expressions almost useless because they weren't in rhythm with the speech. So I'm not sure how much from a kind of primary point of view the audience gets from the facial expressions and gestures because they're not, I mean, the timing of them, if you see somebody go like that to emphasize a word, but the stressed word doesn't come for another 20 milliseconds later, the force is gone. So that was just an observation, but I thought it was an absolutely fascinating presentation. It was beautifully organized, beautifully delivered, and I really enjoyed it. And I'm not surprised there were so many more people here for this one than there were for my one. So there you go.
If it wasn't for you, we wouldn't exist. So
Well, you've taken things a lot further than I ever could have done. So I really congratulate you both. It was brilliant, really enjoyable. Thank
But
you.
yeah, I agree with you that the target audience listening into the interpretation, they get a gist of what the speaker's emotions can be, but they don't sync with what they're hearing. So as I was saying, cross-linguistically, we shouldn't overlap things in such a way. You get a gist of somebody's aggressive or angry or whatever, but you know, the interpreter has a huge role to play to convey that the other effects.
Yeah, but it was really good. Thank you. I enjoyed it thoroughly, and I learned a lot as well about it. So thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Hara and Fabrizio. Thank you for all the people who asked questions. And it was really, really interesting. So our next session in May is not going to happen because it's the Seville conference, which unfortunately I can't be there. But we will be back in June for the final for before the summer. We'll be taking interest, expression of interest for September onwards very soon. Okay. And we will circulate the information about June very soon as well. Okay, so thanks again. And we look forward to, well, you guys can look forward to seeing each other in May. I'll be feeling jealous from here, but I will see you in June online. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.